Starting with GIT pathology, let's start with precancerous lesions of the oral cavity. So we have erythroplakia and leukoplakia. So leuko is white, plakia is plaque. So they're defined as white patches or plaques not less than 5 mm in diameter. So white 5, okay, and it cannot be scraped or removed by scraping, okay. Then it can be seen anywhere in the oral cavity. You can see it in the buccal mucosa, the floor of the mouth, the ventral surface of the tongue, palate, gingiva, etc. The number may be single or multiple, and it appears as white patches or plaques having sharply defined borders. Okay, it may be smooth or wrinkled. Whereas erythroplakia, it is a red velvety area within the oral cavity. It remains slightly in level or depressed with relation to the surrounding mucosa, and the epithelium is atypical. The epithelium itself is atypical, and there is increased risk of malignant transformation than with leukoplakia. So when both intermediate forms are present with both leuko and erythroplakia, they are termed speckled leukoerythroplakia. So age, you can see it in 40 to 70 years. Males usually are 2 times more affected than females, so 2:1. So multifactorial origin is there. There is use of tobacco. So there is so in leukoplakia, you can see surface stratified squamous epithelium showing a spectrum of changes from hyperkeratosis and acanthosis. See, leukoplakia, it is white. So you can see hyperkeratosis, keratin and acanthosis, to lesions with variable degree of dysplastic changes because it is a precancerous lesion. Subepithelial region, you have inflammatory infiltrate. In erythroplakia also, subepithelial region, you have inflammation, but there is vasodilation, because of which there is a reddish clinical appearance. There is intense inflammatory reaction in erythroplakia. There is inflammatory infiltrate of lymphocytes and macrophages in leukoplakia. The surface epithelium, here you can see hyperkeratosis and acanthosis in leukoplakia, and here you can see dysplasia of the surface epithelium and carcinoma in situ or frank carcinoma in erythroplakia. Oral hairy leukoplakia is a distinctive oral lesion, and it is seen in immunocompromised patients. 80% of those people have HIV infection, and remaining 20% are immunocompromised for other reasons. So the etiology, it is due to Epstein-Barr virus EBV infection, and it is located mostly on the lateral edges or border of the tongue. Okay, so oral hairy leukoplakia. So basically you can see leuko, white confluent patches of fluffy hairy thickenings. So it is a confluent patch of fluffy hairy thickenings which cannot be scraped off. Leukoplakia cannot be scraped off, and microscopy you can see again hyperkeratosis and acanthosis with balloon cells in the upper spinous layer of the epithelium. Okay, so look, you have to do biopsy to rule out dysplasia or carcinoma in erythroplakia or leukoplakia, and you use toluidine blue. So it is used to diagnose premalignant lesions of oral cavity. Okay. Next, squamous cell carcinoma in India. Oral cavity cancer is the most common malignant tumor. So squamous cell carcinoma is multifactorial. So basically the risk factors are first smoking and alcohol, then sunlight, mucosal irritation and vitamin deficiency, etc. So first smoking, tobacco products and smoking. So carcinogens in tobacco act as initiators as well as promoters. So smoke tobacco and smokeless tobacco are both there. So smoking may be in the form of cigarette, BD, etc., etc. And then regular marijuana smoking has also been associated with oropharyngeal cancer, and smokeless tobacco, it is in the form of betel quid, okay, or slaked lime, etc., areca nut, whatever. So betel quid appears to be the major carcinogen, but other ones also could be included. Oral cancers are found on the buccal and gingival surfaces where the tobacco products are held in contact with the mucosa for long periods. Next, alcohol consumption. It is another important etiological factor, and it synergistically acts with tobacco either as a co-carcinogen or promoter. Next, other risk factors, you have radiation exposure, sunlight, you have asbestos exposure, you have chronic irritation of the mucosa. It could be due to ill-fitting dentures or jagged teeth, etc. Vitamin deficiency and poor nutrition, vitamin A deficiency. Next, you also have high risk HPV 16 and 18 infection, and low risk also 6 and 11. So there is oncogenic HPV virus infection and inherited genomic instability also. Pathogenesis, so basically it is a multi-step process. So first there is inactivation of the P16 gene in 80% of the cases. So there is hyperkeratosis and hyperplasia. Next, there is P53 mutation. Then it is associated with progression of the hyperplasia or hyperkeratosis to dysplasia. So first, P16 inactivation causes hyperkeratosis or hyperplasia. P53 mutation causes dysplasia. Next, there is amplification and overexpression of cyclin D1 gene, which activates cell cycle progression. So morphology. Anywhere in the oral cavity it can occur. Common sites are lower lip, the ventral surface of the tongue, floor of the mouth, etc. So early stages, it is either firm, it is a raised or firm, a pearly plaque or irregular roughened verrucous areas of mucous thickenings. Remember, verrucous also, it is a variant. So it may be superimposed on leukoplakia or erythroplakia. Later, it is ulcerated. It's not raised. It is ulcerated and protruding gray white mass with irregular indurated rolled borders. Okay, there is a rolled border. And next, microscopy, you have they are well differentiated keratinizing neoplasms to poorly differentiated tumors. So you have keratin pearls, atypical epithelial cells, etc. So spread local tissue involved depends on the primary site lymph node. It depends on the location of the primary tumor. The more anterior the tumor, you can have it to spread to cervical nodes, and base of the tongue tumors, they metastasize to deep retropharyngeal nodes, and blood spread, it spreads to lung, liver and bones. Verrucous carcinoma or Ackermann's tumor is a variant of well-differentiated squamous cell carcinoma. So again, most commonly in the buccal mucosa and lower gingiva, mostly elderly males. So basically, it just looks like carcinoma penis, okay? Just remember it like that. That is my males. And also etiology, same tobacco, alcohol, HPV infection. So it looks like a large fungating soft papillary growth. In microscopy, again, you can see hyperkeratosis and acanthosis because of P16 mutation starting. And also there is benign appearing papillomatosis. Retipex are swollen, voluminous and extend into the deeper tissues. Okay, so spread, it may infiltrate the soft tissues of the cheek, mandibular, axilla and invade perineural spaces also. So what are the other tumors invading perineural spaces? So we have other ones, we'll discuss them later, okay? And oral cavity, majority are squamous cell carcinomas, most common cancer, malignant cancer in India. Okay, most common site of cancer of oral cavity, so tongue is greater than the lip in India, buccal mucosa is greater. Next, you have the risk factors. Okay, other cancer of the head and neck, you have risk factors including Plummer-Vinson syndrome, poor nutrition and all this. Okay, there is field cancerization, which is a phenomenon of susceptibility of the oral mucosa for multiple primary cancers. Okay, so in verrucous carcinoma, basically it is seen in elderly patients. It has a warty appearance, okay, pushing infiltrative margins, okay, and also lymphatic spread is rare. Okay, it is well differentiated, right? So lymphatic spread is rare. Regional lymph node metastases are exceedingly rare. Moving on to salivary gland neoplasms, let's start with pleomorphic adenoma. So it is the most common benign tumor of the salivary glands. It's an admixture of epithelial and stromal elements. Here it is called pleomorphic, not because of nuclear variation, but because it has both it is a mixed tumor. So it has both epithelial and stromal elements because of various cell types seen. So it occurs in 3rd to 5th decade of life, whereas Warthin's tumor occurs in 5th to 7th decade of life. Pleomorphic Leo, it is more common in females, whereas Warthin tumor, it is more common in males. Okay, and major salivary gland, most of the pleomorphic adenomas occur in 60%. It is in the superficial lobe of the parotid. Okay, and then the minor gland involvement is relatively rare. So it is a benign tumor. Exposure to radiation, it increases the risk. So the cell of origin is basically ductal reserve cell origin or myoepithelial origin. Okay, it is a mixed tumor. Next, what is a morphology? So the shape is round, okay, obviously. So just remember this, it is round. Next, the consistency is rubbery. So pleomorphic adenoma is rubbery, okay, and it has a bosselated surface, okay. Just remember, it has a bosselated surface and it is rubbery, and it is well circumscribed or capsulated. In some, the capsule is not fully developed and small extensions can be seen. That is what the bossellation is seen, protruding into the surrounding salivary gland. Next, cut surface, it shows grey-white appearance with myxoid and blue glistening translucent chondroid. So microscopy, here you have the pleomorphic appearance. So epithelial elements, what are they? You have the ductal cells, reserved ductal cells, they are the cells of origin, and myoepithelial cells. So epithelial arrangements, they are arranged in the form of ducts and acini and irregular tubules. Okay, so the ducts are lined by both epithelial cells and surrounded by myoepithelial cells. Okay. Next, they may show strands or sheets of spindled myoepithelial cells. Here you can see they're surrounded by them. There are strands or sheets of them. And then you can see islands of well-differentiated squamous epithelium, which may also be seen. Okay. Next, you can see mesenchymal-like elements. Okay. And also you have the mesenchymal chondroid elements, right? So you have cartilaginous differentiation here. So you have myxoid tissue, islands of hyaline chondroid and mucoid matrix. So it is a rubbery appearance, right? In gross appearance, so it is usually rubbery, well circumscribed, bosselated, right? So here, rubber is, remember in eraser, it is painless. Okay, it is slow and it is mobile. You erase, right? It is mobile and it is a discrete entity, right? So it occurs in the parotid or submandibular areas. The tumors tend to protrude focally from the main tumor into adjacent tissues. And then carcinoma, ex-pleomorphic adenoma, rarely the carcinoma may arise in the pleomorphic adenoma. It is referred to as carcinoma ex-pleomorphic adenoma or malignant mixed tumor. So incidence of carcinoma increases with the duration of the tumor. In microscopy, there is poor differentiation of adenocarcinoma or undifferentiated carcinoma and an otherwise benign pleomorphic adenoma. So pleomorphic adenoma is the most benign tumor of the salivary glands, and again it is less common tumor of other minor glands, and mainly you can see PLAG1 gene mutation. Okay, so PLAG1 is a gene encoding a transcription factor. There is chromosomal rearrangement involving PLAG1, pleomorphic adenoma G1. Okay, so this upregulates the expression of many genes which increase cell growth. So it is encapsulated but pseudopodia like projections into the surrounding gland, pleomorphic adenoma. Okay, it is bosselated, encapsulated, but sometimes pseudopodic things are there. Pleomorphic adenoma, it is unicentric, but recurrences are multicentric, whereas Warthin tumor, it is seen in 5th to 7th decade. It is more common in males than in females. It is exclusive in the parotid gland. Smokers have 8 times the risk of non-smokers. Okay. And morphology, see, it is a round to oval encapsulated mass. Again, it usually arises in the superficial parotid gland. The cut section is a pale grey tumor, punctuated by narrow cystic or cleft-like spaces filled with the mucinous or serous secretion that resembles dark motor oil. So main thing you need to remember in Warthin thing is cystic spaces. So cystic glandular spaces are there in the microscopy. They show papillary or polyploid projections. So cystic spaces, they are lined by a surface superficial layer of columnar cells, and second layer below the superficial layer consisting of cuboidal to polygonal cells. So you have cuboidal to polygonal cells. On them you have surface superficial layer of columnar cells with abundant eosinophilic cytoplasm. Okay, oncocytes. They have abundant mitochondria and resemble responsible for the granular appearance of the cytoplasm. Next, you also have lymphoid stromal tissue which resembles a normal lymph node. See here you can see lymph nodal arrangement, the stromal tissue with a germinal center appearance also, and here you can see 2-layered epithelium, cystic spaces with granular cytoplasm. So it is exclusive in the parotid gland. Okay, and it is 10% multifocal, 10% bilateral, never involves the facial nerve, and it consists of epithelial and lymphoid elements. And finally, moving on to mucoepidermoid carcinoma, it is the most common primary malignant tumor of the salivary glands. And next, etiology. So you have mucoepidermoid carcinoma T1, MEC-T1 or CARET C1. Okay, MEC-CARET. So CARET C1, CRT-C1 gene mutations. Okay, there is a balanced 11-19 Q21P13 chromosomal translocation. Next, morphology, it appears circumscribed, but well-defined capsules are not there, and it is often infiltrative at the margins. Cut section, it is pale and grey-white. It contains cysts. So it is composed of variable mixtures of squamous cells, intermediate cells, and mucous cells. So they are arranged in cord sheets or cystic structures. The intermediate cells have squamous features with mucus-filled vacuoles, mucoepidermoid, right? And the mucus stains positive with mucin stains. Okay, cells may appear highly anaplastic and malignant. So tumors that spread perineurally, you have gallbladder, carcinoma gallbladder, you have bile duct cholangiocarcinoma, then pancreas, then you have adenoid cystic carcinoma and endocarcinoma of the prostate. Moving on to the esophagus, so first we have lacerations or Mallory-Weiss tears. They are Mallory-Weiss tears. They are non-transmural, not the whole wall, okay, not the entire thickness of the wall. They are non-transmural longitudinal tears in the esophagus, longitudinal tears at the gastroesophageal junction. So it is associated with, alcohol intoxication or coughing causes severe retching or vomiting. So because of that, there are variable length, superficial, non-transmural longitudinal tears at the gastroesophageal junction, and that cause their Mallory-Weiss tears, and that they cause hematemesis, and again the healing is rapid. Okay, so that is what you need to know. So clinical features, hematemesis. Next, Barrett's esophagus, it is characterized by intestinal metaplasia in the normal squamous or stratified squamous epithelial mucosa. Okay, so it occurs as a complication to GERD. It occurs in males usually between 40 to 60 years of age. So morphology, see, GERD is a pre-malignant condition, Barrett's, and then it leads to pre-malignant condition called Barrett's, and then you have adenocarcinoma. So morphology, it appears as several tongues, okay? One or several tongues or patches of red velvety mucosa extending from gastroesophageal junction, okay, upwards into the esophagus. Next, microscopy, you can see first metaplasia, obviously. So normal squamous lining of the lower esophagus is replaced by columnar mucosa containing areas of intestinal metaplasia. Next, you can see goblet cells with distinct mucus vacuoles. See here, clear mucus vacuoles. They are seen in the region of intestinal metaplasia necessary for diagnosis. So intestinal metaplasia is an important risk factor for the development of adenocarcinoma. Dysplasia can be seen low or high grade in the metaplastic epithelium. So what are the causes of hematemesis? You have Mallory-Weiss tears, you have esophageal varices, you have esophageal ulcers or reflux esophagitis. Okay. Next, esophageal cancer, you have squamous cell carcinoma and adenocarcinoma as a morphological type. So a squamous cell carcinoma, it is a malignant neoplasm of the esophagus showing squamous differentiation. So again, males greater than 40 years, so males 4:1, 40. Okay. So risk factors, again, smoking, alcohol. Next, nutrition, diet deficient in vitamins. Okay, diet containing trace elements, polycyclic hydrocarbons and nitrosamines, fungal toxins, etc. Hot beverages, especially, it causes thermal cell injury. And then others include Plummer-Vinson syndrome, achalasia cardia, HPV infection, etc. Okay, so all these you can see in Barrett's esophagus basically. Okay, Barrett's esophagus complications, you have strictures, you have ulcers. Okay, Barrett's ulcer, Barrett's strictures, and also risk of carcinoma, whatever. Next, morphology of squamous cell carcinoma esophagus. So in the middle 1/3 of the esophagus, you have squamous cell carcinoma. Lower 1/3, you have adenocarcinoma. Okay, location middle third. So what are the patterns of growth? So squamous cell carcinoma, it can be fungating or exophytic, and it can be ulcerative, or it can be infiltrating or stenotic. So microscopy, what is there? Again, squamous cell pearls, etc. Next, keratin pearls, etc. And spread, so you can have local spread into the respiratory tree, aorta, mediastinum, pericardium, etc. So lymphatic spread. Upper third, they spread to cervical nodes. Middle third to mediastinal nodes and tracheal, paratracheal, etc. Lower third to the gastric nodes. Okay. Next, hematogenous spread also occurs late to liver, lungs, etc. And next, clinical features, what are they? They have, there is dysphagia, there is pain on swallowing or odynophagia and obstruction. Next, finally, adenocarcinoma. It is carcinoma displaying glandular differentiation, usually occurring in a background of Barrett's esophagus and long-standing GERD. So risk factors, again, tobacco use, dysplasia, obesity, radiation therapy, etc. Next, pathogenesis. So it occurs in a stepwise pattern. So first step, there are genetic changes including P53 mutation or overexpression, ERBB2 amplification, cyclin D1 amplification, and then epigenetic silencing by hypermethylation of P16 or INC4A. Okay. So first genetic changes, first step. So you have P53, then ERBB2, ERB2, and cyclin D1. Okay. ERB2, cyclin G1. Next, you have epigenetic changes. So hypermethylation of P16 INC4A, epigenetic silencing, and that leads to adenocarcinoma. So morphology, so it occurs in the lower third location. Appearance, early lesions are flat or raised, and then later lesions are ulcerate or infiltrative. Next, microscopy, it consists of malignant tumor with intestinal type morphology of cells forming glands. So tumors most commonly produce mucin. So clinical features, again, there is hematemesis, there is chest pain, there is difficulty in swallowing, etc. So investigation of choice is endoscopy or biopsy, and adenocarcinoma of esophagus. Risk factors, again, you have all these scleroderma, diet deficient in vitamins, all this thing. Okay, barium swallow in esophageal cancer, you can see rat tail appearance. So moving on to the stomach, so basically we have 4 types of cells in the stomach. So the parietal or oxyntic cells, they secrete both intrinsic factor needed for the absorption of vitamin B12, and also they secrete HCl. Chief or peptic or zymogenic cells, they secrete pepsinogen. And then foveolar cells, they secrete mucin, and endocrine cells, you have G cells which secrete gastrin in the antrum and histamine in the body. So stomach, again, there are several injuries. So erosion is basically a small defect in the superficial epithelium. So it is a loss of superficial epithelium which produces a small defect in the mucosa limited to the lamina propria. Whereas ulcer is a break or discontinuity in the mucosal surface more than 5 mm in size with a depth up to the submucosa. Okay, that is how you classify peptic ulcers based on shallow and deep, greater or less than 5 mm in size. So that only you can elaborate into 3 mm and 6 mm. Okay, shallow and deep. Next, it is only up to the submucosa, remember that. Next, gastritis is inflammation of the gastric mucosa, itis, okay, inflammation, and it is a histological diagnosis. Gastropathy, the term is used when cell injury and regeneration are present but inflammatory cells are rare or absent. So classification of gastritis, there is acute or chronic gastritis based on the inflammatory cells. So there are acute inflammatory cells in acute gastritis and mononuclear cells such as lymphoplasmacytic infiltrates in chronic gastritis caused by Helicobacter pylori, autoimmune gastritis, etc. And based on the segment of the stomach involved, you have antral predominant, corpus predominant, antral body, and pangastritis. Okay. And depending on the absence or presence of pre-malignant stages, you have non-atrophic and atrophic gastritis. Atrophic progresses to carcinoma. So acute gastritis, so basically etiology and pathogenesis, they go hand in hand. So basically drugs. So aspirin, what it does is it basically reduces the mucus and bicarbonate secretion. It causes direct chemical injury, and also it interferes with the protection offered by prostaglandins by reducing prostaglandin synthesis. Next, Helicobacter pylori, they are urease secreting organisms. So they increase urease, which causes an increase in ammonia secretion. And ammonia again causes an increase in HCl secretion, and it decreases bicarbonate secretion. And next, alcohol, it also causes direct mucosal cellular injury, chemicals direct cell injury, severe physiological stress, also burns. Okay, so that is the pathogenesis. Reduced synthesis of mucin and bicarbonate, that is during old age. NSAIDs, they interfere with the protection offered by prostaglandins. Gastric injury, again by urea secreting H. pylori, by inhibition of gastric bicarbonate transporters, ingestion of chemicals, etc. So moving on to morphology, some mild acute gastritis, there are no significant changes. Severe gastritis, remember, acute erosive hemorrhagic gastritis. So acute gastritis progresses to erosions, then hemorrhage, and then that is termed acute erosive hemorrhagic gastritis. Okay, AEHG. Next, microscopy, there is infiltration by neutrophils and purulent exudate in the lumen. So neutrophilic infiltrates. Neutrophils in direct contact with the epithelial cells. Okay, that indicates active inflammation. Next, so presence of neutrophils above the basement membrane in direct contact with the epithelial cells indicates active inflammation, and clinical features, they may be epigastric pain, nausea, vomiting, etc. Next, mucosal disease related to stress. So you have stress ulcers, which are caused by shock or sepsis. They occur with shock or sepsis or severe trauma. Curling ulcers, they occur with burns and in the proximal duodenum. And Cushing ulcers, they occur in the esophagus, stomach, and duodenum in patients with intracranial disease. Okay, so what is the pathogenesis? It is mainly due to local ischemia. So stress, it causes splanchnic hypoxia by splanchnic vasoconstriction. And then again, all these shock, sepsis, burn conditions, and they cause local ischemia. And intracranial disease, by stimulating the vagus nerve, it increases the secretion of gastric acid. All of this causes ulcer. So gross morphology, so it ranges from shallow to deep ulcers. Okay, the site is anywhere in the stomach. The number is single or multiple. Multiple are more common. The characteristics of the ulcer is that the margins and base are not indurated. The floor appears brown to black due to acid digestion of extravasated blood. Okay, the floor is black and the margin is not indurated. Microscopy, so it is sharply demarcated because it is a benign condition and it is surrounded by normal mucosa, and it is an acute inflammatory reaction. Complete healing occurs after the injuring agent is removed. Next, clinical features. There is microscopic evidence of gastric mucosal damage. Next, chronic gastritis. It is chronic inflammation of the stomach associated with mucosal injury. There is an increase of inflammatory cells in the lamina propria, so causes Helicobacter pylori and again autoimmune gastritis, radiation injury, etc. So basically, Helicobacter pylori, they are short, spiral shaped or curved gram-negative bacilli with multiple flagella at one end. They reside on the mucin of the surface of the head and neck regions of foveolar cells. So foveolar cells, on that you have mucin. On the mucin, these organisms, they reside. So acute H. pylori infection does not produce noticeable symptoms. Predisposing factors are poverty, overcrowding, and limited education. So the mode of spread is oro-oral or fecal-oral route. Next, so remember this point. Next, pathogenesis. Basically what happens is antral gastritis is there. Helicobacter gastritis is predominantly localized within the antrum. It is antral gastritis. There is normal or increased local acid production. So local production of gastrin may be increased without increased serum gastrin, so without hypogastrinemia. So basically what happens is there's an increased acid production in the antrum. So local gastrin production increases, and then it can progress to multifocal gastritis. So multifocal gastritis, it can involve other parts of the proximal stomach, and then it can progress to multifocal atrophic gastritis. This is characterized by patchy mucosal atrophy, reduced HCl secretion, reduced parietal cells because of atrophy, right? And also metaplasia. And then there's an increased risk of developing adenocarcinoma stomach. So there's an inverse relationship between duodenal ulcer and gastric adenocarcinoma. So whenever there is intestinal metaplasia, H. pylori are not found. Okay, they do not invade the cells. And when there is metaplasia, the foveolar cells are not there, the mucin is not there, so H. pylori is not found. So mechanism of action, flagella is there, which makes them motile, burrow, and live beneath the mucus layer. Urease, basically what it does, is it breaks down urea to release ammonia. Ammonia increases the pH, makes it alkaline, which causes gastrin to be secreted, and it increases HCl production. Next, you have Kage and Vake, which are involved in progression of the disease, and they cause gastritis or cytotoxins. And then you have adhesins, which help it bind to the mucin layer. Next, host factors. So basically, you have increased inflammation, increased expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines such as tumor necrosis factor and interleukin-1 beta, IL-1 beta by the tumor mucosal epithelial cells, and also decreased expression of anti-inflammatory cytokines such as IL-10, which is protective. So this ensures that neutrophils and macrophages, the inflammatory cells, go there, but the inflammatory mucosal defense is lost. Okay. So microscopically, the characteristic finding is intraepithelial neutrophils and subepithelial plasma cells. That just put a star mark. Intraepithelial neutrophils and subepithelial plasma cells. Okay. Next, also in long-standing cases, the gastritis may extend proximally to involve both the body and the fundus. Okay. Microscopically, it is accompanied by lymphoid aggregates. Okay, these lymphoid aggregates represent an induced form of malt which can transform into a lymphoma. Okay. So demonstration of H. pylori. Initially, the H. pylori gastritis is limited to the antrum. Later, it may extend onto the proximal parts. So H. pylori are concentrated within the superficial mucus. So they have an affinity for gastric epithelium, generally not found in association with metaplasia. So special stains, you have modified GMSA stain and Diffquick stain. Silver stain, you have Warthin starry silver stain and immunohistochemical chemical examination. And next, diagnostics test, you have urea breath test, you have fecal bacterial or copper antigen detection, you have serological test for antibodies, you have demonstration of H. pylori in tissue, which is a gold standard, and gastric biopsy specimens. Next, so all these are there, and H. pylori increased risk of gastric adenocarcinoma and malt lymphoma, and selective medium is Kiros medium and chocolate medium. Okay. Finally, peptic ulcer disease. So it is defined as chronic mucosal ulcer, okay, chronic mucosal ulceration or defect that penetrates the muscularis mucosa. It usually affects the stomach, duodenum or stomach. So duodenal ulcer or gastric ulcer. So peptic ulcer disease, basically it is most often associated with colonization by H. pylori. So normal process in the stomach is that there is a balance between the damaging forces and the defense forces. What are the damaging forces? You have gastric acidity and pepsin. So gastric acidity mentioned that the H plus K plus ATPase is responsible for producing large concentration of H plus, and the cells responsible are oxyntic cells or parietal cells. Then what are the receptors on the parietal cells? You have H2, G1, H2 and M3 receptors. Okay, that's it. Next, gastrin receptors, H2 and M3 receptors. Next, what can you tell about the peptic enzyme? So pepsinogen, it is secreted by which cell? Chief cell. Okay, and autocatalysis is done by the acidic environment itself. So autocatalysis, autoactivation, and then pepsin activity decreases as the pH increases. Just write that point. It is a proteolytic enzyme. Okay, next, what are the defensive forces? They're in 3 levels. So first you have the pre-epithelial barrier on top of the epithelium, then you have the epithelial barrier, and then the subepithelial barrier. So pre-epithelial barrier, you have the surface mucus secretion and the bicarbonate secretion. So basically, it is a mucus bicarbonate layer of the stomach. So surface mucus secretion, mucin is secreted by the surface foveolar cells. So what happens is mucus, it impedes the food particles from brushing against the mucus, and it also impedes pepsin. Bicarbonate secretion, basically bicarbonate is secreted by the surface epithelial cells. So bicarbonate diffuses, if this is the epithelium, so more bicarbonate is here, it generally diffuses so and so onto the gastric lumen. Okay, so that is why pH is 1 to 2 in the gastric lumen, and as you come onto the epithelium, the pH becomes 6 to 7 because bicarbonate content is higher. Okay, and it neutralizes the H plus in the acid. Okay, it buffers the H plus in the acid. Next, you have the epithelial barrier, which consists of surface epithelial cells that act through restitution or reformation or restoration of damaged region by gastric epithelial cells. Next, the epithelial regeneration is there. It is regulated by prostaglandins and growth factors such as EGF and TGF alpha, epidermal growth factor, and then there is secretion of prostaglandins. So gastric mucosa secretes prostaglandin, which plays a main role in gastric mucosal epithelial defense or repair. Prostaglandins, they maintain the mucosal blood flow and epithelial cell restitution. Next, the subepithelial barrier. Beneath the epithelium, what do you have? You have the blood vessels. Okay, so the blood flow, it ensures that nutrients and oxygen is being supplied. It ensures that bicarbonate ions are being supplied, and it also removes the toxic metabolites. Next, moving after we've discussed the basic protective mechanisms and defensive and offending mechanisms, we could discuss the risk factors. So you have H. pylori infection, you have NSAIDs, you have alcohol, cigarette smoking, and hyperactivity such as in Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. So all these, you know, the mechanisms by which they act. So impaired defense is also a part of the etiology. So that in the blood supply, the subepithelial barrier, it could be impaired because of ischemia or shock. There could be delayed gastric emptying, and there could also be other host factors. Okay, moving on to the morphology. So what are the sites of peptic ulcer? The first part of the duodenum, okay, the lesser curvature of the stomach, the gastroesophageal junction, and the anastomotic sites such as gastrojejunostomy. If you do that, it occurs at the margins of the anastomosis. Next number, it is solitary in more than 80% of patients, but it may be more than one. Size, you can call it shallow and deep. So remember the number 5 mm. Okay, in the definition itself, so less than 0.3 mm, less than 3 mm in diameter, you call them shallow. Greater than that, you call them deep. Greater than 6 mm, you call them deep. Next shape, it is round to oval. It is a sharply punched out defect. Remember this, it's a sharply punched out defect, and it appears as spokes of wheel. So radiating mucosa from the radiating mucosal folds from the ulcer, they resemble the spoke of wheel appearance. So margin is usually in level with the surrounding mucosa. Remember that point. Next, depth, it varies, and base is smooth and clean because of peptic digestion of the exudate. Okay, that is what is there. And microscopy, there are 4 Ashkenazi zones of each peptic ulcer. There are 4 layers. So first, there is the superficial necrotic zone. Okay, it is the most superficial zone. Next, you have the superficial exudative zone, which consists of fibrinopurulent exudates. So you have neutrophilic inflammatory infiltrates, and you have all that. Next, you have the granulation tissue, okay, with the mononuclear leukocytes, and then finally zone of cicatrization, which consists of fibrous tissue or collagenous scar, which forms the base of the ulcer and may show chronic inflammatory cells. Okay, so here you can see a punched out duodenal ulcer, which is oval or round. The margin is in level with the mucosa. The base is clean because of peptic digestion. So clinical features, again, young adults are most often diagnosed with it, and there is epigastric burning, and it could be improved or aggravated by food based on whether it is a duodenal or gastric ulcer. Okay, and then so there could be other symptoms like nausea, vomiting, bloating, etc. So they're more associated with morbidity than mortality. They're chronic and recurring lesions, peptic ulcers. So what are the complications of peptic ulcer? Okay, P, remember BPP. So bleeding, perforation, and pyloric obstruction. So bleeding is the most common complication of peptic ulcer. Chronic blood loss may lead to iron deficiency anemia. So severe bleeding may cause coffee ground vomitus or melena. Next, perforation, it is the most common complication of gastric ulcer, PG. Okay, perforation for gastric ulcer. Pyloric obstruction could also be there. Rarely there could be malignant transformation. Okay, so that is what is given here, and here you can see the differences between gastric and duodenal ulcers. So along the lesser curvature of the stomach and along the first part of the duodenum. So duodenal ulcers are more common, and they are also seen in males more commonly, and also they occur between 25 to 50 years. That is a common. Beyond the 6th decade, you can see gastric ulcers. Okay, while writing G, you can write like 6, right? So beyond the 6th decade. So association with H. pylori infection is more common. A strong association is there with duodenal ulcers. Acid level is higher. So if you take food or take antacids, so the pain is relieved in duodenal ulcers. It is aggravated when you take food in gastric ulcers. There is night pain and heartburn in duodenal ulcers. That is why we want to take the alkali or food. Then melena is more common with duodenal ulcers, but hematemesis is more common with gastric ulcers because esophagus is closer to the stomach. And then vomiting is more common with the gastric ulcer. Okay, weight loss is present with gastric ulcer. So finally, ending up with Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, it is a triad with gastrinoma. So there is hypergastrinemia caused by a gastrinoma, and there is increased HCl production with parietal cell population increase, and also severe peptic ulcer disease. So there are multiple recurrent peptic ulcers in the duodenum, stomach, or jejunum, increased acid secretion leading to malabsorption and diarrhea. Okay, inactivation of pancreatic enzymes is there because of increased acid. Okay, there is increase in number of parietal cells, and also hypergastrinemia because of local gastrinoma. There is massive secretion of acid and pepsin. Moving on to gastric adenocarcinoma. So basically, let's start with the epidemiology. It is more common in Japan and in males. So overall, there has been a decrease in the incidence of gastric cancer, but basically, gastric cancer is caused by eating more smoked foods, dietary carcinogens, increase in intake of salted food, and increased preservative-containing food, and also decrease in the intake of green leafy vegetables and antioxidant-rich foods. So moving on to the etiology and pathogenesis. So etiology, first you have H. pylori infection. So basically chronic H. pylori infection, it leads to chronic inflammation of the gastric mucosa, leads to atrophic gastritis. So you lose your parietal cells, there is decrease in acid secretion, which favors bacterial growth, and these bacteria, they convert nitrates into carcinogenic nitrites, dietary nitrates into carcinogenic nitrates. And then this causes mucosal atrophy, intestinal metaplasia, dysplasia, and finally ends in carcinoma stomach. And then Epstein-Barr virus infections. So TP53 mutations are uncommon in these EBV infections. So it suggests a different mechanism of neoplasia. And EBV positive tumors, they tend to develop in the proximal stomach, and most commonly they are of diffuse type with a marked lymphocytic infiltrate. Next, nitrates. So dietary nitrates are converted by bacteria into carcinogenic nitrates are converted into carcinogenic nitrites. And these bacteria, so exogenous sources include diet contaminated by the bacteria itself and infection by Helicobacter pylori, and endogenous factors. So whenever there is achlorhydria or decrease in acid, so bacteria can grow more, and also atrophic gastritis or pernicious anemia and decreased gastric acidity. So basically, what is a pathogenesis? So there is a gene called CDH1 which codes for E-cadherin. It kind of causes cell-to-cell adhesion. So when there is a mutation in CDH1, there is E-cadherin loss and the cell-to-cell adhesion is lost. So the germline loss of function mutations in CDH1 are associated with familial gastric cancer, whereas in case of sporadic gastric cancer, so there is loss of E-cadherin, and there is a key step in the development of diffuse gastric cancer. And also there could be loss of function mutations in CDH1 as well as hypermethylation and epigenetic silencing of the CDH1 promoter sequence, and also BRCA2 mutations. And also sporadic intestinal type gastric cancers, there could be mutations causing increased signaling via the W&T pathway. So APC tumor suppressor gene beta-catenin pathway, okay. And then there could be TP53 mutations, which are uncommon in EBV infections, and also loss of function mutations in other genes such as BAX and CDK and 2A. So morphology, the site is usually the pylorus and the antrum, okay, and lesser curvature is involved more often than the greater curvature. Next, classification of gastric carcinoma. First, you have classification of gastric tumors. Okay, you have epithelial tumors, such as first you have premalignant lesions, then you have adenocarcinoma, tubular adenocarcinoma, papillary mucinous and signet ring cell carcinoma, and then you have adenosquamous carcinoma, and also neuroendocrine you have carcinoid tumor. Mesenchymal you have leiomyoma, leiomyosarcoma, Kaposi sarcoma, GIST, gastrointestinal stromal tumor, or just whatever, schwannoma, etc. Next, gastric carcinoma, it could be early or advanced based on the depth of invasion. So early gastric carcinoma is defined as an invasive cancer that is limited to the mucosa and submucosa, with or without perigastric lymph node metastasis. It is limited to the submucosa. It is not synonymous with carcinoma in situ, which is confined only to the surface epithelial layer. So early gastric carcinoma, again, it is classified based on Japanese classification into these subtypes. So first you have type 1, which is okay, remember it as EFE, okay, or EDE. So first E for exophytic. So first is exophytic polyploid or fungating. So it protrudes into the lumen as a polyploid mass, okay. Next, type 2 is flat, EFE, right? So F is for flat. So flat again could be flat elevated, flat, or flat depressed, okay. So type 2A, 2B, and 2C. And then type 3 is EFE, E again for excavated. So it is characterized by a shallow or deeply erosive center or crater in the wall of the stomach. And then the margins of the ulcer are heaped up, beaded, shaggy, and irregular, and the base is ragged, okay. Base is ragged and necrotic. This is in contrast to that of the benign peptic ulcer, okay. There are punched out margins, but here there are heaped out margins, and here peptic ulcer had a smooth base, clean base. Here there is a necrotic base. And again, advanced gastric carcinoma, it extends below the submucosa into the muscularis wall. So all cancers begin as early lesions, they develop into advanced lesions. And advanced gastric carcinoma, you have Bormann's classification. So again, type 1, it is EFE, right? In the previous one early. So E for elevated, right? So you had exophytic. So here type 1 is polyploid. Okay, remember it like this. Then you have fungating. Next you have ulcerated, and then you have infiltrative, type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. So moving on to the histological subtype, you have Lauren classification. So you have diffuse type and also intestinal type. So diffuse type is characterized by absence of cell-to-cell cohesion, so that individual cells infiltrate and thicken the stomach wall without forming a discrete mass. Intestinal type, so grossly it forms a polyploid bulky tumor, okay, or it may be ulcerated. More commonly, they appear in the antrum and lesser curvature of the stomach, and they are often preceded by a prolonged precancerous process such as a H. pylori infection. Microscopy, it consists of cohesive tumor cells that form gland-like tubular structures resembling adenocarcinomas of the colon. So that is why they are called intestinal type. It probably arises in areas of intestinal metaplasia, and the tumor cells show apical mucin vacuoles. So what is Linitis plastica? We'll discuss that. So in the diffuse type, the cancer infiltrates deeply into the stomach without forming obvious mass lesions. So what happens is the diffuse cells, they infiltrate the stomach wall. There is they then elicit a desmoplastic reaction. In the muscularis layer, the rugae are the folds are flattened, and then the wall thickens. It is called Linitis plastica, or leather bottle appearance of the stomach. Okay. So you can see here, and the microscopy, here you can see discohesive cells because of loss of E. cadherin, which do not form glands. Okay, the tumor cells infiltrate and thicken the stomach wall without forming a discrete mass. And the tumor tests, they contain abundant mucin, which expands the cytoplasm and pushes the nucleus to the periphery, which gives a signet ring appearance to the malignant cells. Okay, if the signet ring cells constitute more than 50% of the tumor, it is classified as signet ring cell carcinoma. So what are the molecular or genomic subtypes of gastric carcinomas? First, you have chromosomal unstable tumors. So there are TP53 mutations. Okay, TP53 are RAS mutations. Next, RAS activation. Next, genomically stable ones, you have CDH1, okay, mutations. Next, in the genomically unstable tumors, you have hypermutation and SIMP. Okay, SIMP stands for CPG, island methylator phenotype. Okay, SIMP. And again, EBV positive tumors, so you have PI3K-CA mutations. Okay. Next, spread of carcinoma stomach. So there is local or direct spread. It spreads into the muscularis and the serous of the stomach. It can invade into the duodenum, pancreas, liver, colon, and retroperitoneum. There could be lymphatic spread. So pattern of lymph node involvement depends on the site of the tumor. They frequently metastasize to the supraclavicular sentinel lymph nodes. It is called the Virchow node, and this is called the Trocheau's sign. Troisier sign. Virchow Troisier sign. Okay, so and this may be the first clinical manifestation of an occult neoplasm. So Troisier sign. Left axillary lymph node, it is the Irish node. It can metastasize to the periumbilical lymph nodes, and it can form a subcutaneous nodule called Sister Mary Joseph nodule. This nodule represents metastasis from the GI tract malignancies. Okay, and then metastasis to the ovaries is called Krukenberg tumor, and metastasis to the pouch of Douglas is called Bloomer shelf. Okay, so site of tumor, if it's the proximal stomach and GE junction, mostly the pericardial and mediastinal lymph nodes are likely to be involved. The body, greater and lesser curvature nodes near the tumor, and tumors of distal stomach, the periduodenal, peripancreatic, and portahepatis nodes are likely to be involved. Next, there could be hematogenous spread to the liver, lungs, and bones. So clinical features in high-risk areas, intestinal type gastric cancer may arise from precursor lesions. Advanced cancer, it presents with early satiety, bloating, distension, and vomiting, and the tumor frequently bleeds, causing iron deficiency anemia. There could be gastric outlet obstruction. There could be Troisier sign. So metastatic lymph nodes may be palpable in the left supraclavicular fossa, Virchow's node, Troisier sign. And then there could be migrating thrombophlebitis in the form of Trocheau's sign. It is a non-metastatic effect. Okay. Trocheau's sign and also DVT, deep vein thrombosis. So prognosis depends on the depth of invasion, the extent of nodal and distant metastasis. So here you can see the differences between benign and malignant ulcers of the stomach. So benign ulcers usually occur in older age, malignant in younger age, and malignant in older age, because you keep accumulating all those nitrates and all that. And duration of symptoms, it is weeks to years in benign ulcers, weeks to months in malignant ulcers, because once there is a benign ulcer, from to become malignant, it's relatively shorter, the time period. Gross, benign is small and malignant is large. Shape, benign is regular and then malignant is irregular. Benign occurs near the lesser curvature and malignant occurs near the greater curvature. Surrounding mucosa, the mucosal radiations are seen, and in malignant conditions especially, mucosal radiations are not seen. And floor of the ulcer is clean in peptic ulcers, especially here it is necrotic. The margins are like spokes of a wheel, they are indurated, rolled over in benign ulcers or peptic ulcers. In malignant ulcers, they are heaped up. And acidity is normal to low in peptic ulcers, but achlorhydria may be there in malignant ulcers. Moving on to gastrointestinal stromal tumor or GIST, it is the most common mesenchymal tumor of the abdomen. The most common location is the stomach. So it is more common in 60-year-old males. So the peak age is 60 years. And there is Carney triad in young females. It is a non-hereditary syndrome. The triad consists of gastric GIST or gastrointestinal stromal tumor along with paraganglioma and pulmonary chondroma. So increased incidence of GIST is seen in patients with NF type 1, so neurofibromatosis type 1. The cells of origin, the GISTs arise from the interstitial cells of Cajal that are located in the muscularis propria and serve as the pacemaker cells for gut peristaltic waves. So what is the pathogenesis? So basically 80% of all GISTs have oncogenic gain of function mutations in the gene encoding tyrosine kinase, so KIT gene. So 8% have mutations that activate a related tyrosine kinase, platelet-derived growth factor receptor, so PDGF-R alpha, receptor alpha. And above mutations cause constitutive activation of KIT or PDGF-R receptor alpha receptor tyrosine kinases. They produce intracellular signals, activate the RAS and PI3K-AKT signaling pathways, and they promote tumor cell proliferation and survival. Few GISTs do not have mutated KIT or PDGFR alpha, but show mutations in other genes involved in these pathways, NF1, BRAF, RAS, etc. So morphology, it is a well-circumscribed solitary fleshy mass, as you can see, well-circumscribed solitary fleshy mass, okay. It is covered by intact or ulcerated mucosa, but it can also project outward toward the serosa. So microscopy, you can see spindle cells, okay, elongated thin spindle cells or epithelioid cells, are mixtures of these two types of cells. And diagnostic markers, obviously there is KIT, which is also, okay, you are writing K like this, right? Okay, take this one, take this one, and then inverse it like this, you get a 7. So CD117 and CD34, the most useful diagnostic marker is KIT, also known as CD117. So immunohistochemical detection is possible in 95% of gastric GISTs, and the prognosis, basically, the tumor size recurrence is less if the tumor size is 5 centimeters, less than 5 centimeters, and mitotic index, mitotically active tumors larger than 10 centimeters commonly metastasize or recur, and location gastric GIST is less aggressive than those of the small intestine. So basically, you use imatinib, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor that inhibits KIT and PDGF R alpha, so it is often useful in patients with GIST. Moving on to carcinoid tumors, they arise from neuroendocrine organs and neuroendocrine differentiated epithelial cells of the GI tract, such as G cells. Now, these tumors are properly termed as well-differentiated neuroendocrine tumors. So what is the site? GI tract is the major site, so small intestine, mostly in appendix, here you can see. And stomach gastric carcinoids may be associated with endocrine cell hyperplasia, chronic atrophic gastritis, and Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, tracheobronchial tree, and lungs. So morphology, gross morphology, you can see. So carcinoids are intramural or submucosal masses, and they are small polyploid lesions. The mucosa may be intact or ulcerated, the mucosa covering the lesion, and it is of yellow or tannin color, as you can see, and it is very firm in consistency due to intense desmoplastic reaction, and it may invade the wall deeply to involve the mesentery. Microscopy, it is composed of uniform cells forming islands or trabeculae or glands or sheets of cells. The cells have scant pink cytoplasm and a round to oval stippled nucleus. Okay, you can see round to oval stippled nucleus. And most tumors show minimal pleomorphism, but rarely may show anaplasia, mitotic activity, and necrosis. So immunohistochemical stains are synaptophysin and chromogranin A. They are positive for endocrine granule markers. Next, clinical features, they peak in the 6th decade of life, and again, if the symptoms depend on the hormones produced, if the tumors produce gastrin, they may cause Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, ileal tumors may produce carcinoid syndrome, etc. Carcinoid syndrome, it develops in less than 10% of patients. The symptoms are due to vasoactive substances secreted by the tumor. So carcinoid tumors, they are confined to the intestine. They secrete vasoactive substances which are metabolized to inactive forms by the liver. So here you can see carcinoid tumor, it is localized or confined to the intestine. They secrete substances that travel to the liver. They are inactivated in the liver and then they enter into the systemic circulation and then they cause carcinoid syndrome. So basically carcinoid syndrome develops when tumors secrete hormones into a non-portal venous circulation. So what are the clinical features? So you have there is flushing of skin, there is sweating, okay, and then there is BC, bronchoconstriction or bronchospasm, and C for colic abdominal pain, and there is right-sided fibrosis, right-sided cardiac valvular fibrosis, and diarrhea. Next, the location is the most important prognostic factor for GI carcinoid tumors. So basically, foregut carcinoid tumors, the sites are stomach, okay, esophagus, stomach, and duodenum. Midgut, you have the jejunum and ileum, and the hindgut, you have the rectum and the appendix. Okay, so again, all these things you have. So those located in the small intestine tend to be malignant. Appendix almost always shows benign course. Okay, and foregut carcinoid, most common location is stomach. They are argyrophilic, so silver staining only with the addition of reducing agent. Midgut carcinoid is argentaphilic, argyrophilic, argentaphilic, and again hindgut is mixed, 70% argyrophilic and almost 30% argentaphilic. So appendiceal carcinoids are typically solitary, okay, and all of this we discussed. So inflammatory bowel disease, it is an immune-mediated chronic intestinal inflammatory condition. Okay, it results from inappropriate mucosal immune activation. So major types of IBD, you have ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. So epidemiology, there's a bimodal peak of inheritance or onset, whatever. So 15 to 30 years, there is one peak, and 60 to 80 years, there is another peak. So in ulcerative colitis, there is 1:1 ratio of males and females occurrence. But in Crohn's disease, it is 1.1 to 1.8:1. Okay, so it is more in males. So prevalence of IBD is higher in urban than in rural areas, and higher prevalence in high socioeconomic classes. And cigarette smoking, it is protective in ulcerative colitis. Next, oral contraceptive use increases the risk of Crohn's disease. And cigarette smoking is associated with an increased risk of Crohn's disease. Next, homeostasis, basic etiology and pathogenesis is that homeostasis occurs between three major host compartments, namely the commensal microbiota, the epithelial cells or intestinal epithelial cells, IECs, and immune cells. So IECs, immune cells, and commensals, they exist in harmony. These three function together. They may be affected by environmental and genetic factors in a susceptible host and produce inflammatory bowel disease. The exact causes are not yet defined. Currently, IBD is considered to be due to an inappropriate host immune response to an endogenous or intestinal commensal microbiota within the intestines, with or without some autoimmunity. So there are obviously some genetic factors. So there is genetic predisposition or susceptibility which contributes to IBD. There are familial factors. It is more common among relatives of patients with IBD than in the general population. So Crohn's disease, genetic factors play a prominent role, and in ulcerative colitis, the genetic factors are less prominent than in Crohn's. So susceptibility genes, NOD2 and CAD15, you need to remember that genes associated with innate immunity and autophagy. They respond to infection and clear the infective agents such as bacteria, mycobacteria, and viruses. So NOD2 or CAD15 is the first Crohn's disease susceptibility gene that was originally known as NOD2. So nucleotide oligomerization binding domain 2, but subsequently renamed as CAD15. So NOD2 or CAD15 gene encodes for NOD2 CAD15 protein, which is required for normal recognition and response against microbes in the intestinal lumen. So actions are, it prevents the entry of microbes, and if the microbes do enter, it regulates innate immune responses, and it prevents excessive immune responses against the microbes. So when there is defective NOD2 or CAD15, the defective protein or gene, it is produced due to mutations in mutant forms that are less effective at recognizing and combating luminal microbes. So defective NOD2, it allows the entry of luminal microbes into the lamina propria of the intestinal wall and stimulates inflammatory reactions. Two other genes are there, namely ATUG16L1, ATUG-LE, okay, I remember 16 as S, so ATUG-SLE, and also IRGM, ATUG-SLE, IRGM, okay. So they are involved in the recognition and response to intracellular pathogens. So let's discuss the three elements. So first, commensal microbiota. The gut lumen contains abundant commensal bacteria. Humans are born sterile, and the commensal microbiota are acquired initially from the mother during passage through the birth canal and subsequently from environmental sources. Each individual possesses a unique combination of species and a stable species of bacteria is achieved by 3 years of age. This composition within individuals is likely to persist to adult life and remain stable for several years. There is control of microbiota. The composition and function of the commensal intestinal microbiota is under the control of the host by immune and epithelial responses, environmental by diet and antibiotics, and likely genetic factors. So there is influence on the epithelial and immune function of the host. The microbiota itself is influenced by the epithelial and immune functions as well as environmental and genetic factors, but it itself influences the epithelial and immune function of the host through its structural components and metabolic activity. Many of the changes occur as a result of inflammation. So there is modification or alteration of intestinal microflora or microbiota, and that can be done by diet and disease. So IBD is associated with an alteration in the bacterial flora of the gut microbiota. There is improved food storage conditions and decreased food contamination. It has reduced frequency of enteric infections with clean environment in the intestinal lumen. So the immune system may not be exposed to microorganisms because of this clean environment, because of refrigerated or less contaminated food. So the immune system is not exposed to microorganisms, and there is inadequate development of regulatory processes that limit the mucosal immune responses. This is called the hygiene hypothesis. So when there is inadequate immune regulation, the untrained immune system, when exposed to the normal commensal antigens, there is inadequate immune regulation which allows pathogens to produce an over-aggressive immune response and uncontrolled chronic inflammatory response in a genetically susceptible individual. Then there could be dysfunction of intestinal epithelial cells or IECs. So impaired defective mucosal barrier function could be there. So basically defects in intestinal epithelial tight junction barrier function is observed in IBD. It can activate innate and adaptive mucosal immunity and sensitize individuals to disease. Also, Paneth cell granules, they contain antimicrobial peptides called defensins, which normally protect the mucosa against adherent and invading bacteria. Abnormal defensins are found in Crohn's disease patients carrying Uttersley mutations. Next, there could be defective immune regulation also. So normal regulatory immune response of the gut mucosa is that normal and uninflamed intestine contains many immune cells in a unique state of activation. Thereby, the gut is prevented from producing full immunological or inflammatory responses against the commensals. But however, there is defective mucosal immune response in IBD. So basically, there is uncontrolled inflammation because the immune suppression of the inflammation is altered. So in a genetically predisposed individual with a defect in the regulatory immune suppression leads to abnormal immune response to non-pathogenic commensal bacteria within the gut microbiome, which activates the CD4 helper T cells in the lamina propria, and then again they differentiate into Th1, Th2 and Th17 type. There is excess secretion of inflammatory cytokines and which is relative to less secretion of anti-inflammatory cytokines. So there is an imbalance between pro and anti-inflammatory mediators leading to uncontrolled inflammation. The environmental factors, you have psychosocial factors which contribute to worsening of symptoms in IBD, major life events such as illness or death in the family, etc. And smoking also, it is protective in ulcerative colitis, but it exacerbates Crohn's disease. Next, there is a hypothesis for pathogenesis of IBD. It is characterized by abnormal mucosal immunological response. It shows lymphocytes, macrophages and other cells of the immune system infiltrating the lamina propria. So in this figure, you can see basically the microbial flora is there. Genetic susceptibility is via the NOD2 and Uttersley genes, okay, IRGM also, and also there are environmental factors which cause impaired mucosal barrier function and also IECs. There could be immune dysregulation by activation of CD4 helper cells, which again causes breaks in the IEC tight junctions. So the whatever the antigenic trigger, activated T cells in the lamina propria are involved in the pathogenesis of IBD. So one hypothesis, it signifies the role of intestinal microbiota, epithelial function and mucosal immunity. So what are the various events? So basically there is a transepithelial flux of luminal bacterial components. If this is a lumen, there is a transepithelial influx of bacterial components because they can pass between the leaky epithelial cells or they can enter the lamina propria through ulcerated mucosa. So they can enter via the M cells also, microfold cells, okay. So basically when they enter through the microfold cells and dendritic cells, there are antigen presenting cells which present the antigens, okay. They present the antigens, these antigen presenting cells, and to what do they present? They present them to helper T cells. Next, what happens is helper T cells, they get activated and they differentiate into three types. So they differentiate into Th1 by IL-12, Th2 by IL-4, and Th17 by IL-23. So then these three differentiated ones, what they do is Th1, it again releases interferon gamma, it causes macrophage activation, and it causes increased permeability of epithelial cells, which causes further entry of bacterial components into the lamina propria. It is a self-amplifying reaction, self-amplifying cycle. Okay, it increases the tight junction permeability by activating macrophages. Next, Th2 cells secrete interleukins such as 4, 5, and 13. So 13 induces superficial inflammation of the mucosa, and Th17 cells secrete IL-17, IL-21, and again IL-23. So IL-23 is essential for the development and maintenance of Th17 cells. They require they kind of gather neutrophils. Okay, Th17 cells. Okay, they recruit neutrophils. So the above mentioned pathways occur in all normal individuals exposed to an inflammatory insult. They are self-limiting in healthy subjects. Now, before moving on to Crohn's disease, we need to remember that polymorphism of IL-23 receptor is protective in IBD. Okay, so now let's get on with Crohn's disease. So Crohn's disease, basically, it is defined as a chronic multifocal relapsing and remitting progressive IBD of unknown cause that can involve any portion of the gastrointestinal tract. So I have this mnemonic for Crohn's disease, not just mnemonic, it's based on rhyming. So Crohn starts with C, right? So Cr for creeping fat. Okay, and then C for cobblestone appearance. Cobblestones, you have stone here, you have stone here, so there is a skip lesion. Okay, Cr for crypt abscesses. Cr for crypt architecture is lost, and C for caseating, so non-caseating granuloma, and it is transmural. And again, so basically aphthous ulcers, they're early, they coalesce to form serpentine slit-like ulcers, and then they form fissures, then they form fistulae. Okay, this is a basic thing. So gross, it can involve any site of the GI tract location from mouth to anus, but most commonly it is located in the terminal ileum, ileocecal valve, and the cecum. So number of lesions usually multiple, and each lesion is sharply demarcated from the intervening normal bowel, giving rise to characteristic skip lesions. It helps in differentiating it from ulcerative colitis. So mucosal lesions, first there is an aphthous ulcer, which is the earliest lesion. So Crohn's disease, aphthous ulcer is the earliest lesion. Multiple lesions may coalesce to form elongated snake-like serpentine ulcers along the axis of the bowel. Next, the ulcer may become deeper and form linear clefts or fissures. Okay, and it may extend to form a fistula tract or site of perforation. The mucosa shows edema and loss of normal mucosal folds. The ulcers may fuse longitudinally and transversely. The islands of normal mucosa between the ulcers show edema and produce a cobblestone appearance. Okay, so intestinal wall, in the involved region, it is fibrous, so there is fibrosis, and it is rubbery. The lumen is narrowed. So if you do a radiological examination, if you give a fluid, okay, it passes through a very narrow lumen and it looks like a string, so it is a radiological string sign. It appears like a hose pipe. Next, external surface or serosa, there is serositis, so it appears red, opaque, hyperemic, and covered with serosal exudate. When the disease shows extensive transmural involvement, the subserosal fat is often firm and contracted over areas of involvement. This may encircle around the antimesenteric serosal surface, producing a pattern known as creeping fat. Okay. Next, adhesion, so involved loops of bowel may adhere to each other. So microscopy, Crohn's disease is a chronic inflammatory process, so mucosal ulcers and inflammation will be there. So early there are aphthous ulcers, and there are small superficial ulcers, and the inflammation in the initial phase may be limited to the mucosa and submucosa. Both show edema and increase in number of lymphocytes, plasma cells, and macrophages. Next, crypt abscesses can be seen. So here you can see crypt abscesses. So they are characterized by the presence of numerous neutrophils within a crypt. Okay, these neutrophils may infiltrate and damage the crypt epithelium and are often associated with crypt destruction. So once you have crypt abscesses, there could be distortion of the mucosal crypt architecture. So normally crypts are straight and parallel to each other, but repeated cycles of crypt destruction and regeneration lead to bizarre branching shapes and unusual orientations, referred to as distortion of the mucosal crypts. Then there could be epithelial metaplasia. So there is pseudopyloric metaplasia. It is characterized by the occurrence of glands which appear like those in the gastric antrum. And then there could be Paneth cell metaplasia. Next, non-caseating granulomas are hallmarks of Crohn's disease. They are mostly seen in the submucosa, as you can see here. So basically, when present, they are poorly formed. They consist of focal aggregates of epithelioid cells surrounded by a collar or a thin rim of lymphocytes. Next, transmural inflammation is there. It is characterized by chronic inflammation involving all layers of the intestinal wall and may show lymphoid aggregates in the submucosa or subserosa. Next, clinical features. So there is mild diarrhea, fever, and abdominal pain. And periods of active disease are usually interrupted by asymptomatic periods. Okay, so disease may be reactivated by external triggers such as physical or emotional stress, specific diet, cigarette smoking, etc. So extraintestinal manifestations are important. So uveitis, migratory polyarthritis, sacroiliitis, ankylosing spondylitis, erythema nodosum, and clubbing of the finger. So lab findings, so ESR and CRP are raised. In severe disease, there is hypoalbuminemia, albuminemia, and anemia and leukocytosis. Barium study measures string sign. Next, complications of Crohn's disease because of fistula or whatever, blood loss. You can have iron deficiency anemia. Then there could be malabsorption, so extensive involvement of the small intestine may result in loss of protein, hypoalbuminemia because of loss of protein absorption. Next, stricture formation could be there, fistula formation could be there. And then acute complications are perforation and hemorrhage. The carcinoma can develop, and also systemic amyloidosis is rare. Okay, this is a mnemonic for Crohn's disease. Moving on to ulcerative colitis, it is a severe chronic crypt-destructive ulcerating inflammatory bowel disease of unknown cause. It is limited to the colon and the rectum, whereas Crohn's disease could occur diffusely everywhere, but ulcerative colitis is limited to the colon and the rectum, colitis, okay? And inflammation involves only the mucosa and submucosa of the intestinal wall. Okay, so gross, basically ulcerative colitis, it is a diffuse disease limited to the colon and the rectum. So as you can see, limited to the colon and the rectum. Skip lesions are not seen, okay? And mucosa appears slightly red and fine granular, okay? Slightly red, fine granular or smooth. It is frequently covered by a yellowish exudate and bleeds easily. So as the disease progresses, mucosal folds are lost, there is mucosal atrophy. Next, small superficial erosions or broad-based ulcers may develop later. Ulcers are aligned along the long axis of the colon but do not appear like serpentine ulcers of Crohn's disease. Next, pseudopolyps are there. That's an important point. So pseudopolyps are inflammatory polyps that develop in long-standing disease. Isolated islands of regenerating mucosa may bulge into the lumen. After mucosal atrophy, the regenerating mucosa, the isolated islands, they bulge into the lumen of the bowel to produce small elevations called pseudopolyps. Next, inflammatory process is diffuse without skip lesions, and it is limited to the mucosa and superficial submucosa, and bowel wall is not thickened. There is no fibrosis. The serosa is normal and strictures are not there. Next, in severe cases, the inflammation may damage the muscularis propria and disturb the neuromuscular function, lead to colonic dilation and toxic megacolon. It can undergo perforation. So microscopic features are similar. So there are inflammatory infiltrates, crypt abscesses, crypt distortion, pseudopyloric epithelial metaplasia. However, the inflammatory process is diffuse and it is usually seen in the mucosa and superficial submucosa only, and granulomas are not found. Non-caseating granulomas are not found. So mucosa shows inflammation limited to the mucosa and submucosa. So both mucosa and submucosa shows edema, increase in number of lymphocytes, plasma cells, and macrophages. So there are changes in the crypt. So basically, cryptitis means there are neutrophils in the crypt. Okay, their neutrophils are hallmark of acute disease. Next, clusters of neutrophils within a dilated crypt, that is known as crypt abscess, and these crypt abscesses are usually associated with destruction of crypts. The term chronic active colitis is used when acute activity is superimposed on a background of chronic changes. Then histological hallmarks of chronicity, the regenerating epithelium is immature and as such does not contain mucin. So there is mucin depletion, which is another important point. There is mucin depletion. There is distortion of the crypt architecture. It is due to repeated destruction and regeneration of the crypts. The crypts may appear shortened, tortuous with bizarre branching and decreased in number. And there could be chronic inflammatory infiltrate. So there's an infiltrate of lymphocytes and plasma cells and macrophages, which is seen only in the mucosa and superficial submucosa. There is distortion of crypt architecture and increased mucosal chronic inflammation. Okay, these two are characteristic findings of UC, ulcerative colitis. Basal plasmacytosis and multiple basal lymphoid aggregates are seen. Next, mucosal atrophy occurs in late stages. It is flat without any normal folds to the mucosal surface. And Paneth cell metaplasia is common. Loss of goblet cells and mucin depletion is characteristic. And dysplastic changes in the epithelium may be there. It may progress to carcinoma. Okay, next, based on the region involved, if the entire colon is involved, you call it pancolitis. Next, if it is limited to the rectum, you call it ulcerative, not colitis, but ulcerative proctitis. Then ulcerative proctosigmoiditis, if it extends from then on. And then backwash ileitis is ulcerative colitis involving the distal ileum. Okay, So you have the microscopic features, so cryptitis and cryptabscesses, inflammatory infiltrates, then architectural crypt distortion, epithelial metaplasia, and basal plasmacytosis. So it occurs mainly in young adults. The triggering event is infectious enteritis and psychological stress. Okay, it is a relapsing disorder with exacerbations and remissions. So intestinal manifestations, there are attacks of bloody diarrhea with mucoid material, lower abdominal pain, etc. Some extraintestinal manifestations, again you have the same things: migratory polyarthritis, sacroiliitis, ankylosing spondylitis, uveitis, all these things, erythema nodosum, etc. But extra you have primary sclerosing cholangitis here. So what are the complications? There is toxic megacolon. The inflammatory mediators and inflammation can damage the muscularis propria and disturb the neuromuscular function, which can lead to colonic dilatation and toxic megacolon. There also colorectal cancer, hemorrhage from the intestinal lesions leading to blood loss, and electrolyte disturbances due to diarrhea. Prognosis depends on the severity of active disease and the disease duration. So here you can see everything. Granulomas and skip lesions are not seen, pseudopolyps are seen, and mucin depletion is seen, basal plasmacytosis is seen, etc. Next, moving on to intussusception, it is an invagination of one segment of the intestine into the another, immediately adjacent distal segment. So what are the causes? In infants and children, usually there is no underlying anatomical defect, but in older children and adults, so there is a mass or tumor in the wall of the bowel which disturbs the normal peristaltic contractions there. It forces the lesion and a segment of the proximal bowel into the distal segment of the intestine. The lesion acts as a point of traction and causes intussusception. The lesions include polyps, ingested foreign bodies, Meckel's diverticulum, etc. So morphology in children, the most common site is ileocolic, and in adults it is colocolic. Next, growth and intussusception consists of three parts. So the intussusceptum, which is the entering inner tube, the returning middle tube, it is the second part, and then the outer part is intussuscipiens, which is a sheath or outer tube. Okay, next effect is that untreated intussusception may lead to intestinal obstruction, compression of the vessels, and infarction of the bowel. Next, Hirschsprung disease. It is a congenital abnormality. It is also known as congenital aganglionic megacolon. So it may occur as an isolated event or in combination with other developmental anomalies. About 10% of all cases are found in children with Down syndrome, and serious neurological abnormalities are present in another 5%, and it is more common in males. Next, the pathogenesis, basically the neural crest cells migrate into the intestinal wall during embryogenesis. The enteric neuronal plexus develops from these neural crest cells. So premature arrest of migration of neural crest cells, that results in Hirschsprung disease, because Hirschsprung results from a congenital defect in colonic innervation. When the normal migration of neural crest cells from cecum to rectum is arrested prematurely, or when the ganglion cells undergo premature death, this produces a distal intestinal segment without both Meissner's plexus and Auerbach's plexus. This is aganglionosis. So this defect usually begins at the rectum but extends proximally for variable lengths. So what are the consequences? The above abnormality can lead to absence of coordinated peristaltic contractions and functional obstruction. This leads to proximal dilation of the affected segment. So mechanisms, the cause of defective neural crest cell migration is not known, but heterozygous loss of function mutations as a genetic component in the receptor tyrosine kinase RET is responsible for majority of the familial cases of aganglionic megacolon or Hirschsprung disease. Next, so morphology, the segment involved, the Hirschsprung disease always affects the rectum and in most cases limited to the rectum and sigmoid colon, but it can extend proximally from then on. Next, appearance, the affected aganglionic region may be grossly normal or contracted. The proximal part to it may undergo progressive dilation. So diagnosis, it is by demonstrating the absence of ganglion cells in the affected segment. So what are the clinical features? They present in neonates as a failure to pass meconium in the immediate postnatal period. It is followed by obstructive constipation with visible ineffective peristalsis. So the complications include enterocolitis, fluid and electrolyte disturbances, perforation and peritonitis. The treatment is surgical resection of the aganglionic segment with anastomosis of the proximal colon to the rectum. Moving on to polyps of the colon. A polyp is basically defined as a mass that protrudes into the lumen of the gut. That's it. So polyps are most common in the colon, but they may occur in the esophagus, stomach or small intestine. They are of clinical importance because of their tendency to undergo malignant transformation. So according to the gross appearance, they are classified as sessile and pedunculated. So sessile, they do not have a stalk. Pedunculated, they have a well-defined stalk. And according to the histopathological appearance, so you have non-neoplastic and neoplastic. Non-neoplastic you can remember as HIH. So hyperplastic, inflammatory, and hamartomatous. Neoplastic you can remember as benign or malignant. So benign, again you have adenomas, so tubular, tubulovillous, and villous. Okay. Next, moving on to inflammatory polyps, they're pseudopolyps. You have seen them in ulcerative colitis. So they're raised nodules of inflamed, regenerating epithelium, mucosal epithelium. That's it. These lesions are not precancerous. So microscopically, they're composed of distorted and inflamed mucosal glands and granulation tissue. Next, hamartomatous polyps. They're rare tumor-like growths. They consist of mature tissues that are normally present at the same site in which they develop. They may be associated with intestinal and extraintestinal manifestations. Next, juvenile polyps. They are focal, hamartomatous malformations of the mucosal epithelium and lamina propria. They occur in children, juvenile, less than 5 years of age. They are located in the rectum and commonly present with rectal bleeding. So, juvenile polyposis coli syndrome, so JPS, it is characterized by multiple juvenile or inflammatory polyps distributed throughout the colon or GI tract. There is an increased risk of colonic adenocarcinoma. So, most are greater than 5 years of age, less than 3 centimeters in diameter. So it is pedunculated, spherical, smooth surfaced, and red in color. And cut section you have cystic spaces. So microscopically you have cystically dilated glands filled with mucin and inflammatory debris, and lamina propria is expanded due to mixed inflammatory infiltrates. Next, Peutz-Jeghers syndrome or PJ syndrome. It is a rare autosomal dominant syndrome. Jeghers dominant syndrome. Median age of presentation is 11 years. Jeghers 11. Satakli, okay, STK11. So you remember it as Satakli gene on chromosome 19 has been found in a proportion of these patients. So it is characterized by multiple GI hamartomatous polyps and mucocutaneous hyperpigmentation. So Peutz-Jeghers, remember pedalu. So mucocutaneous hyperpigmentation along with multiple hamartomatous polyps in the intestine. Okay. So remember that it is associated with an increased risk of several malignancies and it includes cancers of the colon, pancreas, breast, etc. So morphologically, the most common site is the small intestine. So Peutz-Jeghers pedalu, okay. So PU intestine, okay. Next, number, it is present in dozens. Size varies from few millimeters to several centimeters in diameter. So gross, it is large and pedunculated with a lobulated contour. Microscopically, there is hyperplastic mature epithelium. It is divided by broad bands of mature smooth muscle. Here you can see arborizing bands of smooth muscle, branching bands of smooth muscle, which divide the hyperplastic epithelium. Okay, hyperplastic mature epithelium. Next, small intestinal PJ polyps consist of crypts and villi of varying lengths, divided by arborizing bands of smooth muscle fibers that commonly fan out from the center of the polyp and has a tree-like appearance intermixed with the lamina propria. Next, hyperplastic polyps, they are due to metaplastic proliferation of the differentiated colonic epithelium. There is no malignant potential. They are most common non-neoplastic polyps of the colon and are frequently seen in the rectum and age 6 and 7 decades of life. So site is most common in the left colon. So it is small, smooth, sessile and nodular protrusion of the mucosa. It is single, small, smooth and sessile. Okay. Next, microscopic, there is the composition of elongated colonic crypts lined by epithelial cells. So with a pseudopapillary configuration, so there is a sawtoothed or serrated appearance. Next, neoplastic polyps. The most common and important neoplastic polyps are colonic adenomas with the potential for transformation into colorectal adenocarcinomas. So classification, it is based on the growth patterns of pedunculated, sessile or flat or depressed, and also architecture, so tubular, villous or villous. So general features, size, they range from a few millimeters to few centimeters in diameter. Almost 50% of all adenomatous polyps of the colon are located in the rectosigmoid junction, rectosigmoid region. Remaining 50% are evenly distributed throughout the rest of the colon. Microscopy, all colorectal adenomas are low-grade dysplastic lesions. They are characterized by the presence of dysplasia of the epithelium. It may be classified as mild, moderate and severe dysplasia. So classification, tubular, tubulovillous or villous. So tubular adenocarcinomas, they constitute 2/3 of the adenomas of the large intestine. They appear as small, smooth surfaced and pedunculated polyps less than 2 centimeters in diameter. And microscopy, it consists of closely packed, small rounded or tubular glands embedded in the stroma. Okay. So they show enlarged hyperchromatic nuclei and variable degree of dysplasia. You can see, right? Okay, arborizing bands, all that. Next, moving on to villous adenomas. So they constitute 1/10 of colonic adenomas and are predominantly found in the rectosigmoid region. So grossly, they are large, broad-based, sessile, elevated lesions with a cauliflower-like surface. So here you can see they are large, okay, the villus adenomas. They are looking like villi. They are large, broad-based, okay, sessile. They don't have a peduncle, okay, and they're finger-like okay, and they're elevated lesions with a cauliflower-like surface. And microscopically, they're composed of thin, long finger-like projections, papillary growth, which superficially resemble the villi of the small intestine, okay. They contain foci of carcinoma more commonly than tubular adenomas, and tubulovillous adenomas, they show a mixture of both tubular and villous elements. Next, sessile serrated adenomas are more common in the right colon and histologically overlap with hyperplastic polyps. They have malignant potential but do not show dysplasia. Microscopically, they consist of serrated architecture throughout the full length. Next, intramucosal carcinoma. It is a term used when dysplastic epithelial cells break the basement membrane and invade into the lamina propria or muscularis mucosa. Since there are no functional lymphatic channels in the colonic mucosa, intramucosal carcinomas do not have metastatic potential, and complete polypectomy is usually curative. Moving on to familial adenomatous polyposis, or AD or FAD. So it is an autosomal dominant inherited syndrome characterized by hundreds to thousands of adenomas throughout the colorectum, as well as numerous extracolonic manifestations. So genetic features, remember FAD, right? FAD. So F for 5. So 5q21 APC gene is involved, okay. So APC is a tumor suppressor gene, and it's adenomatous polyposis called APC gene. So its products modulate a specific signaling cascade, or WNT signaling, that regulates cell proliferation. So every cell of FAP patient has one inactive APC allele, and the second inactivation initiates the early phase of the neoplastic change. Minimum of 100 polyps are necessary for a diagnosis of FAP. Morphology, it is similar to sporadic adenomas. So here you can see FAP with numerous polyps in the colon, okay. Next, all untreated FAP patients develop colorectal adenocarcinoma often before age of 30 years. So prophylactic colectomy prevents colorectal cancer. So there are associated symptoms such as Gardner syndrome when the extraintestinal manifestations of FAP are prominent. The condition is known as Gardner syndrome. The extraintestinal lesions include osteomas of the mandible, skull and long bones, epidermal cysts, desmoid tumors, etc. Next, Turcot syndrome. It is a rare syndrome characterized by colonic adenomas with tumors of the CNS, particularly medulloblastomas. Next, HNPCC, or hereditary non-polyposis colorectal cancer syndrome, or Lynch syndrome. It is a colon cancer family syndrome not classically associated with large numbers of colonic adenomas. Despite the name HNPCC, adenomas do develop, although not in large numbers in HNPCC patients. So it is transmitted as an autosomal dominant condition. It is characterized by increased risk of colorectal cancer. Again, the patients develop cancer at younger ages than sporadic type, and they are found in the right proximal colon. Okay, HNPCC, Lynch syndrome, right proximal colon. Extracolonic cancers are also present. They include cancers of the endometrium, ovary, stomach, etc. So the genetics, they are caused by germline mutations in DNA mismatch repair genes, MMR genes. These genes encode proteins involved in the detection, excision and repair of errors that occur during replication of DNA. One result of defective DNA MMR gene is a phenomenon referred to as microsatellite instability, MSI. It occurs in about 90% cancers in HNPCC. Appearance of an abnormally long or short DNA, abnormally long or short microsatellites in DNA is referred to as microsatellite instability. So MSI is divided into three groups depending on the alterations in microsatellite length: MSI high, MSI low, and MS stable, MS. So about 6 mismatch repair genes have been identified, which are designated as HMSH 2, 6, okay, 2 and 6, MLH 1, 3, PMS 1 and PMS 2. But majority of HNPCC cases involve 2 genes, MSH2 and MLH1. The MMR genes act as tumor suppressors, and loss of both copies of the genes result in unrestrained growth and ultimately neoplastic transformation. HNPCC patients inherit one defective copy of an MMR gene, and the second gene is lost or inactivated as a somatic event. Loss of the second gene often occurs due to methylation of the gene promoter. Moving on to colorectal adenocarcinoma. So basically, adenocarcinoma of the colon is the most common malignant tumor of the GI tract. So etiology and risk factors. So the dietary factors, starting with low intake of dietary fibers. So basically, if there is less intake of dietary fibers, there is decreased peristalsis. So there is slower transit of the fecal contents. It increases the contact time of the fecal contents with the mucosa, and there is increased synthesis of toxic oxidative byproducts of bacterial metabolism, which remains in contact with the colonic mucosa for longer periods, and it may bind to potential mutagens and dilute their concentration by increasing the stool bulk, dietary fiber. So if this is not there, then carcinogens may accumulate and cause cancer. Next, there is high intake of refined carbohydrates and fats. So ingestion of animal, not vegetable, animal fats such as red meat and processed meat, it increases the proportion of anaerobes in the gut microflora, and there is increased hepatic synthesis of bile. So there is conversion of normal bile acids and cholesterol into carcinogens by the anaerobes, and this causes increased risk of colorectal cancer. Next, there could be insulin resistance. So increased calorie intake along with physical inactivity is associated with a higher prevalence of obesity, and these obese individuals, they develop insulin resistance and increased circulating levels of insulin. This results in higher circulating concentrations of insulin like growth factor 1, IGF-1, okay, which stimulates proliferation of the intestinal mucosa. Next, hereditary factors and syndromes. So family history of the colorectal cancer is found in up to 25% of patients, which suggests the possibility of a hereditary predisposition. So inherited colorectal cancers can be divided into two main groups, namely uncommon polyposis syndromes and the more common non-polyposis syndromes. So FAP, we've already discussed this. There is 5q21 gene mutation, APC gene is affected. Next, there is MYH associated polyposis or MAP, which is a rare autosomal recessive condition, okay, involving a mutation in the MUT4H gene. Next, there is HNPCC due to mismatch repair gene mutations and all that. Next, you have inflammatory bowel disease. We discussed that also. So other factors are Streptococcus bovis bacteremia, increasing age, family history of colonic cancer, prior colorectal cancer, and tobacco use. Next, factors that decrease the risk, you have dietary factors. So diets rich in cruciferous vegetables such as cauliflowers, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage. So Brassicaceae or crucifery family, and also vitamin A rich diets may be associated with a lower incidence of colorectal cancer. So deficiencies of vitamins A, C, and E, which act as antioxidants, may increase the damage caused by oxidants. Next, you have protective effect of aspirin. So it is a pharmacological chemoprevention. So ingestion of therapeutic agents such as aspirin or other NSAIDs may reduce the risk of colorectal cancer. It may be due to the fact that they cause inhibition of the COX-2 enzyme, which is expressed in 90% of colorectal carcinomas and 40 to 90% of adenomas. It is required for the production of prostaglandin E2, which promotes epithelial cell proliferation, particularly after injury. Next, pathogenesis. So most colorectal cancers, they develop from the combination of multiple molecular alterations. They can mainly be divided into genetic abnormalities and epigenetic abnormalities. So genetic pathways, you have the classic adenoma carcinoma sequence and microsatellite instability pathway. So the classic adenoma carcinoma sequence, most colorectal cancers arise from adenomatous polyps. So this sequence is seen in about 80% of sporadic colonic cancers. According to this pathway, the morphological progression is in a stepwise specific manner sequence from normal mucosa to adenoma to invasive cancer. It is accompanied by a series of multiple molecular alterations. So first, remember this, okay? So ACRAS 53, okay? APC CRAS 53. Remember this order. So first what happens is APC is an important negative regulator of beta-catenin. Normally what happens is the WNT receptor is present on the cell, and beta-catenin, it is when it binds to APC, it is degraded, it is broken down. But when WNT molecules bind to the receptors, WNT receptors, what happens is APC cannot form a complex with beta-catenin, so beta-catenin binds to its receptors on the DNA, and then there is cellular proliferation. However, when there is a mutation in the APC, so beta-catenin, there is excessive cellular proliferation because it immediately binds to the DNA. It is not broken down. Okay, that is one thing. So basically, when it forms a complex with the transcription factors, it activates the transcription of C, Mike, cyclin D1, etc. It promotes cell proliferation. Next, after APC, CRAS, you have CRAS. So loss of APC function is followed by mutations in proto-oncogene CRAS, which results in oncogene CRAS, promotes cell proliferation, and also prevents apoptosis. Next, CRAS mutations is a late event. Next, after that, CRAS, then before P53, you have SMAD, right? Okay, so SMAD2 and SMAD4 mutations are tumor suppressor gene mutations. They may develop as the neoplasm progresses. The genes are effectors of TGF-beta signaling, which is normally a potent inhibitor of cell progression. Loss of this may cause uncontrolled proliferation. Next, finally, there is a mutation of TP53. It is seen in 70 to 80% of colon cancers, but it is commonly affected in adenomas. So TP53 mutations also occur at late stages of tumor progression. Mechanism of inactivation is by chromosomal deletion or methylation of a cytosine residue or CpG rich zone, CG rich zone, or CpG island. Okay. Next, in activation of the telomerase, a telomere plays a role in stabilizing the chromosome. It shortens with each cell division. So it is required to maintain telomere stability and hence immortality. Most adenomas do not show telomerase activity, but colorectal carcinoma have increased telomerase activity. Expression of telomerase also increases as the lesion progresses. Next, the other one is microsatellite instability pathway. So microsatellites are repeated sequences. They are tandem repeats of 1 to 6 nucleotides in the genome. So they become unstable during normal cellular replication, leading to insertion or deletion of bases within these regions. DNA mismatch repair genes rapidly correct these errors to maintain microsatellite length. But mutations in the normal DNA MMR genes leads to accumulation of microsatellites referred to as microsatellite instability. About 6 MMR genes have been discovered, most commonly MSH2 and MLH1 in case of HNPCC syndrome. So microsatellites are typically formed in non-coding regions. However, some microsatellite sequences are located in the coding or promoter region of genes involved in regulation of cell growth. For example, microsatellite instability involving the type 2 TGF-beta receptor. Normally, it inhibits the cell proliferation and mutation. But mutation in TGF-beta signaling or the receptor, it can lead to uncontrolled growth. Next, proapoptotic gene BAX. Its mutation can lead to loss of BAX, which may increase the survival of genetically abnormal clones of cells by decreasing the apoptosis. Next, finally, the epigenetic changes. You have a CpG island hypermethylation phenotype. So this is a subset of colon cancers with microsatellite instability in which there are no mutations in the DNA repair mismatch repair genes. So these tumors have CpG island hypermethylation phenotype or SIMP. So in these tumors, there is hypermethylation of MLH1 promoter region, which reduces MLH1 expression and repair function, and activating mutations in the BRAF oncogene are common in these tumors. KRAS and TP53 are not usually mutated. Thus, a combination of microsatellite instability, BRAF mutation, and methylation of specific target SIMP, such as MLH1, are seen in this pathway, epigenetic pathway of carcinogenesis. So, other epigenetic abnormalities, they may enhance the progression along both genetic pathways mentioned above. So, epigenetic changes involve histone modification, acetylation or DNA methylation, both of which include gene expression. So, silencing occurs by hypermethylation. So morphology of carcinoma colon. So location, it can be found in any location. Types. So first you have exophytic polypoid masses in the right side, right cauliflower. Okay. So polypoid masses, they extend along one wall of the cecum and descending colon on the right side. Next, on the right side. Next, on the left side, there are annular constricting napkin ring or apple core constricting tumors. So it may be associated with intestinal obstruction and dilatation, with attenuation and flattening of the mucosal folds of the colon proximal to the tumor. Next, there could be diffuse or tubular tumors. It can resemble linitis plastica of the stomach. There is diffuse flattening and thickening of the colon, but later it involves the entire wall of the intestine. Next, there could be infiltrative and ulcerating tumors. They are usually raised. They have irregular edges and central ulcerated area. Microscopy. So basically, majority of the colonic cancers are adenocarcinomas and are similar on microscopic examination. Adenocarcinoma may be well differentiated, moderately differentiated, or poorly differentiated. Most of the tumors, they show glands of variable size and configuration separated by a moderate amount of stroma. The mitotic figures are usually abundant. The lumen of the glands is usually filled with inspissated eosinophilic mucus and nuclear and cellular debris. The invasive component of these tumors may show stromal desmoplasia, which causes firm consistency. Poorly differentiated carcinoma shows only few glands. So mucinous adenocarcinomas, they secrete abundant mucin and accumulate along the intestinal wall and are associated with poor prognosis. And there could also be signet ring carcinoma. It consists of signet ring cells similar to those in gastric cancer. Next, tumors in the cecum and right colon, they are usually presenting with fatigue and weakness due to iron deficiency anemia. Okay, right side, right cauliflower, right? So iron deficiency anemia. Next, important to note that it is important to note that iron deficiency anemia in an older man or postmenopausal woman should be considered due to GI cancer until otherwise proved. Left-sided cancers may produce occult bleeding, altered bowel habits or pain and discomfort in the left lower quadrant. So modes of investigation, there is occult blood loss in the stool by the Guaiac test, tumor markers elevated CEA or carcinoembryonic antigen and also CA19-9, and sigmoidoscopy, colonoscopy, and it can be used to take a biopsy, which is the investigation of choice. And you can give a barium enema, which shows characteristic apple core appearance, double contrast barium enema, and USG also can be done, and spiral CT can also be done. Staging and prognosis depends on the depth of the invasion and the lymph node metastasis. They are the two most prognostic factors. So So invasion into the muscularis propria reduces the survival rate, which is reduced further in the presence of metastasis. Poorly differentiated and mucinous carcinomas are associated with poor prognosis. So now we use TNM staging from the American Joint Committee on Cancer. Next, spread, direct spread. It can spread in a transverse spread circumferentially along the intestinal wall and cause obstruction, longitudinal spread along both directions, and radial spread directly into the submucosa, into the muscularis propria, and into the serosa, pericolic fat, lymphatic veins, etc. Next, lymphatic spread. The tumor may spread through the lymphatics into the regional lymph nodes. Lymph nodes draining the colon are grouped as N1, so immediate vicinity nodes, N2, nodes along the ileocolic, right colic arteries, midcolic arteries, and N3, the apical nodes along the superior and inferior mesenteric vessels. Next, blood spread. So venous invasion may give rise to blood-borne metastasis in the liver, and it may also spread to lungs and bones, and transcoelomic spread can be there. Rarely it can spread by dislodging tumor cells from the serosa of the bowel or via the subperitoneal lymphatics to other structures within the peritoneal cavity. Finally, let's end GAT with a discussion on acute appendicitis. So the appendix is prone to acute and chronic inflammation. The acute appendicitis is an acute inflammatory process involving the appendix. It can occur in any age group, but it is most common in adolescents and young adults. So moving on to the pathogenesis, the etiology is multifactorial and may involve obstruction, ischemia, infections, and hereditary factors. So basically, acute appendicitis, it is thought to begin with luminal obstruction due to a fecolith or a gallstone or a mass of worms called oxyuriasis vermicularis, and then this increases the intraluminal pressure. This increase in intraluminal pressure causes stasis of the luminal contents and leads to ischemic injury. This further elicits inflammation and causes edema, and this inflammatory debris and edema cause the pressure to rise further, resulting in gangrene, perforation, and peritonitis. So morphology, the appendix may be swollen and erythematous. The serosa appears dull and grey and later may be covered by purulent exudate. Perforation secondary to gangrene can follow and it can form an abscess. Microscopy, so the early lesions, they show mucosal ulcerations, mucosal erosions, okay, loss of the mucosa. Next, the inflammation extends into the lamina propria, and then collections of neutrophils may also be seen in the lumen of the appendix. Okay, muscle layer is also infiltrated by the neutrophils. Diagnosis should be made when muscularis propria shows infiltration by the neutrophils. Next, in severe cases, neutrophilic exudate produces fibrinopurulent reaction in the serosa. So when focal abscesses develop within the wall, it is termed as acute suppurative appendicitis. When appendix shows large areas of hemorrhagic ulceration and gangrenous necrosis, it is known as acute gangrenous appendicitis. It may rupture, causing suppurative peritonitis. So clinical features, it presents with pain in the periumbilical region localizing to the right lower quadrant. It is followed by nausea, vomiting, etc. There is McBurney's sign. So McBurney's point is a line joining the umbilicus and the right anterior superior iliac spine. So the point is between on the line between the medial 2/3 and lateral 1/3 at the junction. So there is maximum tenderness there, McBurney's sign. And complications, there is gangrenous appendicitis, perforation, portal venous thrombosis, liver abscess, and bacteremia.